Welcome to today's Explainer. We're digging into an absolute masterclass in wealth building. It's a mechanism of modern finance that's sitting right there, completely in plain sight within the US tax code. We're going to peel back the layers and look at the exact playbook the ultra-wealthy use to build and keep massive fortunes. So here's the billion-dollar question. How do the world's richest people legally avoid paying income tax? For most of us, taxes are just inevitable, right? They're an automatic deduction from your paycheck. But as you'll see, the reality of high net worth finance operates on a totally different set of rules. Okay, let's dive into this. Look at these names. According to IRS data highlighted by the NYU Law Review, billionaires like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Michael Bloomberg have legally paid $0, yes, literally zero, in federal income tax in at least 1 year since 2005. How on earth is that mathematically possible when their net worths are skyrocketing by billions? Well, to understand this, we kind of need to frame this whole explainer as a peek behind the curtain of a grand magic trick. Because here's the thing, they aren't evading taxes. Evasion is illegal. They're avoiding them, using the exact rules written right into the tax code. All right, moving into Section 1, the billionaire tax illusion and the reality of consumption inequality. To get this trick, we first have to understand the realization doctrine. Basically, you're generally only taxed when you actually sell an asset. Let's look at Bob and Alice. Bob's an everyday earner who pays immediate tax on his salary. That leaves him with significantly reduced spending power. Now compare that to Alice, a high net worth individual who needs some cash. Instead of triggering a realization event by selling her stock and paying capital gains tax, she just borrows against her portfolio. That loan, it's completely non-taxable, creating this massive gap in what we call consumption inequality. By borrowing against their assets, the ultra-wealthy can consume way more tax-free cash than everyday workers earning a regular paycheck. That brings us to Section 2, how buy, borrow, die works. We're going right behind the curtain of the magic trick. Back in the 1990s, law professor Edward J. McCaffrey coined this exact three-step strategy to explain the phenomenon. Step 1 is buy. You park your capital in appreciating tax-deferred assets, think real estate or massive stock portfolios. Step 2 is borrow. You use those assets as collateral to fund your lifestyle, entirely tax-free. And step 3, well, it's die. This is the ultimate tax shield, literally allowing you to wipe out all those deferred capital gains. So the crucial point is how this borrowing step actually functions in the real world. Wealthy individuals use financial tools like an SBLOC, that's a security-backed line of credit. Institutions like Charles Schwab offer what they call a pledged asset line. You pledge your stock portfolio to the bank and boom, they give you a giant line of credit. The real beauty of this for the borrower is that as long as your asset portfolio is large enough compared to the loan, the bank often doesn't even require you to make monthly payments. The interest just rolls right into the loan. And most importantly, because borrowing is not considered a realization event by the IRS, you generate entirely safe, non-taxable cash to live on. It's wild, right? But eventually, you die, which, ironically, is the grand finale of the trick. It relies on a specific tax rule called the stepped-up basis. Let's say you bought stock for $5 million, and over your lifetime it grew to $30 million. If you sold it while you were alive, you'd owe capital gains tax on that $25 million profit. But if you die and leave it to your heirs, the IRS steps up the cost basis to the fair market value on the exact day you died. So it becomes $30 million. If your heirs sell the stock the very next day for $30 million, their taxable gain is exactly $0. They can sell the assets entirely tax-free, pay off the bank loans you accumulated over your life, and legally eliminate all of those deferred taxes forever. The whole shebang, just gone. Let's look at Section 3, the maths behind the magic, and the staggering scale of tax deferral. Now, you might be thinking, doesn't taking out massive bank loans for decades eventually bankrupt these portfolios? Well, let's look at the numbers. And this brilliantly illustrates why it absolutely does not. Looking at a 35-year projection from financial analyst Ofer Gandel, let's take a $10 million portfolio growing at a 15% return, which is pretty typical for private equity or high-end real estate. If they fund their lifestyle the normal way, selling assets and paying taxes each year, their wealth grows to a very impressive $260 million. But if they use the buy, borrow, die strategy, avoiding capital gains, and letting that unbroken compounding work its magic, their net worth explodes to $450 million. That is nearly double the wealth, all generated simply by changing how they access their cash. But what about all that debt? Believe it or not, by year 35, the debt load drops to just 5% of their total assets. How is that possible? because the appreciating assets are compounding at a much faster rate, say 15%, than the interest rate on the loan, which might only be, 6 to 9%. The debt load actually peaks around year 10. But as the portfolio growth goes totally parabolic over the decades, the relative size of the debt shrinks to a tiny fraction of their net worth. The math doesn't just work out, it heavily, heavily favors the borrower, highlighting a massive systemic advantage that traditional income earners simply do not have access to. All right, Section 4, Fixing the Tax Loophole. Let's impartially evaluate some policy solutions. We are taking a completely impartial, objective look here at the policy options evaluated by the NYU Law Review, and we can see some distinct hurdles for all of them. First up, a wealth tax. This faces severe constitutional risk. Because a wealth tax is a tax on personal property, making it a direct tax, the U.S. Constitution actually requires direct taxes to be apportioned by state population, which makes a federal wealth tax highly vulnerable to being struck down by the Supreme Court. Second, we have a mark-to-market tax. This would tax unrealized gains every single year. It faces medium constitutional risk, but it severely lacks public support. People generally like the realization rule. They really don't want to be taxed on a house that hasn't even been sold yet. Finally, repealing the stepped-up basis. This suffers from what's called political optionality, because future Congresses can easily reverse the repeal, which, fun fact, actually happened after 1976 and 2001. Billionaires can simply defer their taxes and just wait out the political cycle. Moving to our final section, Section 5, Taxing the borrow step, a pragmatic alternative. Because those traditional solutions face massive gridlock in the courts and Congress, legal scholars have pointed to a much more surgical alternative. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this policy called realization at borrowing. Instead of trying to tax wealth directly, it simply treats secured loans against appreciated assets as a realization event. Basically, borrowing triggers the tax. This elegantly sidesteps all the hurdles we just talked about. It avoids the constitutional risk of a direct wealth tax because, hey, it's still taxing a transaction. It bypasses that political optionality because you are taxing the borrower while they're alive and spending the money, rather than just crossing your fingers and hoping a future Congress taxes their estate 40 years from now. And finally, it maintains the broadly popular realization rule for everyday Americans who aren't taking out massive security-backed lines of credit. It directly and surgically attacks the borrow step of the magic trick. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. Will the tax code ever catch up to the reality of modern wealth? We've seen how 20th century tax laws, which were built around standard paychecks and basic asset sales, completely clash with 21st century billionaire finances. The tools of wealth creation have evolved into this highly sophisticated machinery of deferral and borrowing. Whether lawmakers will embrace pragmatic solutions like taxing the borrow step or continue to battle over broad wealth taxes, well, that remains to be seen. But one thing is absolutely certain for sure. The magic trick of buy, borrow, die is no longer a secret. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.